Welcome to Israel in Depth, where scholars and experts come to discuss topics about Israel in depth. You're listening to a podcast by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm Dov Waxman, the host of this podcast and the director of the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Joining me for this episode of Israel in Depth is Arnon Degani, a UCLA-trained historian who is now a fellow at the Harman Center for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a research fellow at Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. He is also the writer and host of Hesket Oslo, a podcast about the Oslo peace process currently being developed into an English version titled Still Processing. He has published several historically informed essays and op-eds about Zionism and the Palestinians, and is currently teaching an introductory course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Lehigh University. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I've asked Dr. Degani to join me on Israel in Depth to talk about a scholarly paradigm that has become very controversial when applied to Israel and Zionism. That is the paradigm of settler colonialism. It's been commonplace on the left to characterize Zionism as a settler colonial movement and to regard the state of Israel as a settler colonial state. But what do these terms actually mean? And what are their policy or political implications? So let's begin, therefore, by defining these key terms. Arnon, what is settler colonialism? What are its essential characteristics? And what differentiates it from other types of colonialism?
Well, we have to start by saying that I would imagine that more than 90% of the people listening to this podcast, if they have some sort of definition of what is settler colonialism and how it's applied to Israel or Zionism, that they have it wrong. That's
why we're having this podcast,
right? and to the point where I'm not sure that the concept is salvageable. But settler colonialism, the way I see it and the way I think it's productive, I don't want to take over authority over the concept and its intricate meanings, but I find it productive as a historian and a researcher of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if it's not viewed as a subset of colonialism. It is rather within, can be described as being on the opposite end of colonialism, on a spectrum that is European, or I would say capitalist expansion over the globe. Capitalism as a system expanded all over Earth via one vector was the control or even influence, sometimes direct or indirect, of core nations, mainly in Western Europe. And another way for capitalist relations and production to spread all over the globe were societies that were capitalistic that planted themselves in other places all over the globe. And settler colonialism is on one end of that spectrum and colonialism is on the other. They are not mutually exclusive. Considering this is a spectrum, then historical reality inhabits everything in between. But for the purposes of analysis, it is useful to look at this as a spectrum. And when I say Israel is settler colonial or Zionism is settler colonial, when I say all these things, it's really saying it's just closer to the settler colonial end.
I see. So if colonialism is on one end of the spectrum and settler colonialism is on the other, and these two terms are often, I think, in public discussion kind of conflated and confused. Exactly. How do they differ? What's the difference between settler colonialism and, what most people imagine as colonialism, which, as you said, is the kind of expansion around the world of historically of European states beginning in the 16th century?
So analytically, again, the difference is almost night and day. It features but maybe let's start with what might be similar. It features a movement from people from one part of the world to another part of the world. That we see. But the colonial move across space is one that centers on the sovereignty of the origin state. It's an expansion of the origin state. The ideal type settler colonial movement across the globe is one that centers on the sovereignty of the settler. That is characterized by a high level of distinction from the place that they are leaving. And again, because this is a spectrum, because these things are fluid, because these things actually don't exist in the ideal type, it is a tool for us to analyze, then the notion that Zionism never had a clear patron state, a clear imperial center, like the settlement movement into North America, for instance, which had Britain, or in Latin America, Spain and Portugal. So the notion that this is what makes Israel or Zionism incompatible with colonialism, that would be correct, because it is not colonialism. But in fact, the mere fact that Zionism its inception is as a sovereign, as a distinct movement, definitely not related to the Russian Empire or the Polish state or the French Republic. It makes Zionism adhere even more closely to the ideal type of a sovereign movement across land. It's that the moment that you're moving from one place to another, you become something else that's not the same as you were before. And it's obviously not there. You're not there to integrate seamlessly with the indigenous people.
I see. So
or the people who were there before. Indigenous is very, very loaded.
Right. So colonialism then refers really to this idea of a mother country, a kind of metropole, sending colonists overseas, generally for profit or geopolitical interests. And settler colonialism, by contrast, is really not about the motivations behind this colonization, but rather focusing on the attributes of the settlers themselves.
Precisely.
Okay, so understanding this concept of settler colonialism, when did it start to be applied to Zionism in the state of Israel? Can you give us a little bit the kind of history behind the usage or the application of this paradigm to the case of Israel? Is this a new thing, or is this something that's actually been, typical of scholarship for some time?
Well, the first people to benefit from a comparative approach, which is essentially what this is, between the Zionist situation, the Zionist the Zionist problems, the dilemmas that Zionism faced with other settler movements, were Zionists. And of course, it's a very popular trope among people who are anti-Zionist or would like to parade the colonial or settler colonial aspects of Zionism. They constantly point out that this was a term that was used by Zionists to describe what they were doing, right? But if you look, for instance, and the best example would be Jabotinsky's Iron Wall from 1923, the way he uses it to better understand the situation, the dilemma, the right way forward, kind of a very cold, dispassionate analysis. There's no sense of denying Jewish connection, Jewish rights to Palestine. No, he's not denying ancestral connection, cultural connection. But he's saying that since what we're trying to do in Palestine is similar to what other settlers, mainly North America and Latin America, try to do there. And for him, the moral, religious, cultural connections are irrelevant to the fact they're not irrelevant. They're relevant for the people who are already there, right? And he calls them indigenous, Yelidim, but he's not calling them Yelidim in the sense that he sees actually that their connection to the land is the one that's inherently moral or inherently just. He sees their connection is their indigeneity manifests in the fact that they just don't see any reason to share the land with people that have newly arrived, and they do not share the narratives and justifications that Zionists have. So in that sense, they're indigenous. They have their politics is based on the notion that they were there first and that they are the true inheritors or the just inheritors of the land, and not the people that recently came with a Eastern European accent. So Jabotinsky uses this in order to explain Palestinian intransigence in the following decades. They would not accept us because they see us as foreigners, no matter how we see ourselves and no matter how benevolent our project might be towards them. And so I would say that was a very sharp use of the settler. He doesn't call it settler colonialism. He calls it colonization in the English translation, and something probably equivalent in the Russian original. He uses the same term used in Russian to describe other acts. He doesn't have the settler colonial versus colonial distinction vocabulary, but he understands that the project that is being done is similar to what we today can see are more settler colonial projects, and not so colonial, by the way. He didn't pretend that this was a project meant to serve a metropole, a European metropole.
Okay, so initially the term is used, even if not literally the exact term, as a kind of in a purely descriptive way, in an analytical way, yes, by Zionists themselves,
and Arlozerov and others for sure, and Ben Gurion I think alludes to these problems as well.
So why then, given that willingness initially at least to acknowledge the similarities with other settler colonial societies and the processes, when does it shift to being seen in a more, let's say, normative light? That this idea, and I think the resistance to the paradigm for many people, for many Zionists, is that it's seen as a kind of it's not just a descriptive claim, but a normative claim, one that implies a degree of maybe illegitimacy to the Zionist project, and that there's an underlying assumption that, or it's perceived to be that Jews therefore are foreigners, essentially, just as the English settlers were foreigners in settling in the United States, for example. When does it take on that kind of normative? Take on? Yeah.
Well, the first stage, it has to do with that there is a tingling of normative normative implications even even very early on, because according to what Jabotinsky says, at the very least, such a project requires the people who are already there to share the land against their will. So from the get-go, this is not something that exists for the benefit of one group at no expense and no implication to the other. There's already an understanding that there's a tie between settlement of people in a new land and the status, landholding, and a myriad of other important things to the people who are already there. I think another stage would have to be the post-colonial era, right? Where where colonialism was sort of seen in more negative terms. In 1923, it's still a way that a lot of it's after the First World War, Wilson's 14 points, self-determination of nations is starting to come kind of denormative way of dividing up the Earth's landmass. But I would say after the Second World War, at the ushering of the most successful settler colony in the world, the United States, colonialism, the idea of a European nation or an East Asian nation like Japan controlling another nation, that becomes morally irreprehensible and almost illegal in international law, I guess, through various UN decisions and legal precedents. So that is another stage, the idea of one people controlling another. I would also, another thing I think that contributed to this in the scholarly community, and there's a lot of feedback between scholarship and public opinion. I think a lot of settler colonial discourse that we see today comes from people who are not far away from their undergrad studies or they're still in the undergrad stage and other places in academia. So I would say an important book by a researcher called Prochaska in 1983 about Algeria, who uses the term settler colonialism. But for him, it is not a sort of a paradigmatic or a part of a wider theory of capitalist expansion and something existing on a different. He's saying settler colonialism is the type of colonialism we saw in Algeria, right? And that makes sense because there is at least a quantitative difference between Algeria and other cases, because Algeria featured a strong, a very high level, a large number of French or French national settlers who made it to the land of Algeria. So settler colonialism is identified with Algeria because of this very important book. It's called Making Algeria French, and it takes a case study of a town on the coast called Bonn or Annaba, and it really shows how the settlers have shaped the colonialism that occurred in Algeria, but it is not. But it is not. There's no argument to saying that this is a different species of human phenomenon. It's still colonialism, has its, like every colonial case everywhere has its distinct cases. So I think this is how settler colonialism more easily found its way to being conflated with as a type of colonialism, because one very important scholar at a time where this was the available language used it as a way to express just that, and came up with an excellent book, excellent historical book. And then there's also the fact that Israel itself features what is more classically settler colonialism, its inception as in foreign lands and a low level of dependence on of identification with a foreign empire, right? You could say that during the Mandate period, there were even Zionist fantasies of extending this connection to the British Crown, but these were not the main thing. Was Zionist was Jewish sovereignty, and then after 67. After there is a state, it's a consolidated state, it's recognized in the UN, that state has experiences border expansion and sends off settlers to other places. Those settlers are very much identifying with the Israeli metropole. They're, only on the fringes of, especially in the 70s, there's a sense of Medinat Yehuda, the state of Judea, the more radical ones. They are an extension. They extend the citizenship. They have no separate sovereign claims. The opposite. They actually want the sovereign to become more invested in these new territories. And so you have more of an Algeria model existing at after 67, not before. And because we call these people settlers, and because some of the way Israel rules the Palestinian territories is reminiscent of colonial era. Of course, there's no citizenship, no equal rights between the occupiers and the occupied. That also seems to take there. So it becomes like a huge mishmash of concepts and phenomenon that is the messy reality that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is. But the way the term settler colonialism is used today doesn't help us navigate better this mess.
Well, let me just return to the earlier period that we were talking about in terms of the initial arrival of Zionist settlers from the late 19th century onwards. Which is more controversial. I think it's less controversial to maybe consider the post-1967 settlement of the West Bank and Gaza to be.
But the opposite. But in the way I'm saying it, the post-67 is not settler colonial. At least in its it is colonial.
More colonial. But in terms of the settler colonial aspect. One of the key objections, we already discussed the question of kind of the lack of a mother country, a lack of a metropole sending the settlers to Palestine in the late 19th century. Does the settler colonial paradigm rest upon this distinction between native and foreign, or indigenous and foreign? Because one of the objections, it seems, that many Zionists have is the insinuation that somehow Jews are actually foreigners, that they don't have any historic tie, and that they are not the indigenous inhabitants. So that would seem to challenge the similarity with Zionist settlers elsewhere. This was a group of people who saw themselves returning to their homeland rather than establishing a new place of residence.
Well, first of all, it should be noted that the attachments of people to a certain land, while we may, as Zionists, for instance, we may find ours to be more justified than others, but that's not something that historians can arbitrate it. Who has the more just connection to the land? Obviously, as historians, you can't deny the fact that there is a Jewish history to this land, that there is cultural, religious, a national even. I mean, we can't deny that the ties between Jews way before Israel began were national ties, and Israel and this territory of land was part of that national tie. So these things that are undeniable, and I won't deny them, and that is one thing. What people are, when people demand that I recognize Jewish indigeneity to the land, or that's their problem with settler colonialism, it's they want historians to be the arbiters of who holds the deed to this land. They want us to find within our toolbox of historical analysis some sort of moral justification for one group of people, usually any kind of human group. It's very hard to define them in genetic terms and in even cultural terms, our case, linguistic terms, but to characterize how that there's an inherent connection between a group of people. Its borders aren't necessarily understood. If you're a convert, then you automatically belong to the land as someone who hasn't converted. But in any case, they want us to assert the justness of this connection, the organic aspects of this connection. I don't know, sometimes like the idea that the universe aligns once Jews are in that land. And I am not capable of doing that, nor am I interested in doing that for the Palestinians as well. I don't see their indigeneity as somehow, I don't see the return of all the refugees from all of the Middle East as setting the universe in unison and balance, and this would be the just thing to do. That might be my politics or not, but that is not my mandate as a historian. And so when I use indigenous and settler, it is merely a way of describing how two groups relate to each other. One, objectively recently came, and the other was there before. One is very much interested in changing the lay of the land, making the land absorb more of these settlers, changing the politics to make that land willing to absorb more of these settlers, maybe clearing land to have room for more settlers. And the indigenous people in this language I'm offering are not interested in those things. And that, I think, is a rather objective yardstick. And of course, that would lead us to see a very important difference that Zionism has compared to others. That is something no one can deny. No one can deny that when Zionist settlers arrived in the 19th century, they encountered Jews, sometimes Jews that were like-minded about the project, right? So there was a settler contingency among the indigenous people. And of course, they were as indigenous as any Muslim or Christian at the time, right? And so that makes things different. Yes, I think that enables the Zionist movement to strike root, to convince the other people around the world about the logic and justness of Zionism. But it doesn't change the fact that in order for when Zionism starts, it still has to make major changes to the political and geographic and demographic lay of the land.
Are there, and what I'm getting at is, are there other cases, let's say, of settler colonialism where the colonists were coming, as they saw it, coming home? I mean, whether they were away for a very long period of time, in the case of Zionist settlers, their understanding is not that they were foreign, they're trying to create an entirely new society in a new place, but rather to recreate a society that once existed, admittedly, thousands of years before. And so aside from the kind of normative dimension, just analytically, the argument, the objection, it seems to me, of those who object to the settler colonial paradigm is that it treats Zionist settlers as if it negates that earlier history, that unlike settlers in any other case, they weren't leaving their home country to arrive in a new place, but rather they were going home. And that mindset of we are now, that does fundamentally change the relationship between indigenous and native, because each side claims indigeneity, whereas in other cases there isn't that mutually conflicting claims of indigeneity.
there's two things here. There's claims of indigeneity are very common among settlers. No matter how they imagine the land they arrive, they very quickly see themselves as the indigenous people, and often that when there's a metropole involved, they do that vis-a-vis the metropole. They do that sometimes by creating myths and realities of mestizo, of assimilation or some sort of miscegenation with the indigenous people, and saying we're different now, and our difference from the Spanish or the Portuguese has to do with the fact that we have become indigenous by virtue of joining the people who are already there. I wouldn't say that's a weaker claim than the ones that than the Zionist claim of past sovereignty, which is again historically correct. There's no way of denying it. So claims of indigeneity exist all over. It's almost that is almost a characteristic of settler colonialism. Colonialism, if anything, they never want to be native. Going native is the wrong thing to do, but indigenization is very characteristic of a settler movement. And the idea of it, look, I teach at Lehigh is located at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, right? So there is a mythologizing, for instance, of new lands as being the new Israel and the Christians that arrive there as being the new Jews. That is obviously a mythology, unlike the reality of Jewish presence in Eretz Israel for millennia long. But you know, we're talking about humans. This is our subject of research here. And humans, the ability to imagine things is sometimes as strong as with or without some sort of archaeological or
in the case of
historical basis.
But there is, in the case of Zionist settlement, there is that archaeological bit. I mean, it's not just...
Yes, no, I can't deny that. Of course, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't deny it. I'm a historian. How can I deny it?
Doesn't it make it then a unique... I mean, you know...
It makes it unique. Zionism is unique in many, many ways. Many ways, right? I can't even count them. But it's not unique in the sense that the people there are not happy about Zionism.
Right, of course, but that...
So much of Zionist history has been determined by the relationship with the people who were already there. Then not all of it, but so much of Zionist history has to do with the conflict. Then settler colonialism is an important, I would say, central way of understanding the twists and turns of our history, because so much of our history has to do with the fact that there's a population that just didn't want us to do this project.
Right, but I guess the alternative paradigm that's governed much of this understanding of the conflict for a long time is simply that of a national conflict between two groups competing over the same piece of land, each of which claims exclusive rights to sovereignty within that contested territory. The settler colonial paradigm, by contrast, seems, at least the way it's commonly understood, you know, to move away from this notion of a national conflict between two groups, and rather regarding it as one as a kind of much more similar to colonial conflict, right? Between, yeah.
Nationalism is a very important way of understanding what we're doing here, but we can't deny the fact that this particular national movement started outside the borders of the country that the nation claims to itself. You can't deny that. And so because this is a national movement that it started outside, right? Then the problems, the resistance, the geographic and political problems that it has is similar to other settler movements. Again, it is a national movement. I'm not one to deny the national character of Jews of European descent, and even, you know, across the Mediterranean, The idea that we are a nation, it's definitely something that exists as a concept, very in ancient times. But this reality of Jews being the onset of the modern era, Jews being all over the world, a candidate to form a national group, right? The fact that the overwhelming majority of these members of this potential national group was not located in the country. Right. That makes the fact that to fulfill this national project, people have to move to another place, and that other place is not empty. That is what makes it settler colonial. Not no denial of a national aspect to Israel, to Zionist, to the Zionist project and Zionist ideology. It's very much a national one, but it is confounded, is constrained, it is limited by settler colonial circumstances, you can say.
I see. So what does that mean? Now, I want to, we don't have much time, so I want to talk about what are the implications of this. Let's accept that this a paradigm is applicable, however kind of distinctive or unique the aspects of Zionist settlement might be. What are the implications of that? I mean, the scholarly argument has often been, I think, that there's an inherent logic to settler colonialism, which involves either the elimination or the displacement of the indigenous population, and that the only way to end this logic, right, is by kind of decolonization, whatever that means. So if we accept the validity of the settler colonial paradigm, what does that mean for our understanding of Israel's history? Is it then that has Israel, as other settler colonial societies, also pursued this eliminationist logic? Is it somehow not just in its origins, but in its treatment of the Palestinian population also distinctive?
So it's true that if you read the literature, mainly by Patrick Wolf and Lorenzo Veracini, also Dirk Moses, that you see elimination as a structural tendency that settlers have towards indigenous people. But if you understand indigenous, right, as those that are rightfully are of the land and of a certain culture that was shaped by the stones and the winds, and then you won't be getting it right. If you understand indigeneity as the inherent resistance to a political project that's started outside, then you can get rid of that indigeneity in ways that are not genocidal, right? One way of doing that is to create some sort of mutual ethos between the people that have recently arrived and the people that have or were already there. Mestizo, mestizo,
kind of a combined identity.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And really make and not, it's not eliminating. It might not lead to the physical liquidation of a community. It does entail cultural change, usually, because it needs an adaptation to new political structures which will contain both groups. But it doesn't necessarily have the necropolitical aspect of genocide, people dying, and although it often does. And what is basically being eliminated is the claim for exclusive indigeneity, right? What is an indigenous person in the way I describe it if he or she or they are willing to see the person that has more recently arrived as his co-patriot? Then the sense of indigeneity becomes more folklore, or or even of one of a segment within a liberal society, a multicultural society. But if there is a if there is a willingness by people who belong to the indigenous group to recognize those that more recently came as having equal rights in the land, then that is the moment where the indigenous is eliminated. But of course, there's a difference between ethnic cleansing and the endowment of citizenship and creation of a binational arrangement.
Right. So in policy terms, then it doesn't necessitate, this idea that recognizing the settler colonial aspect of the conflict doesn't necessitate either the expulsion of the settlers, which some people believe, they've just got to leave. I mean, that's what some radical college students might imagine. That's what it requires, is the, go home. Nor does it necessitate, you're arguing, the elimination of the indigenous population or the expulsion or displacement, but rather the dissolution of the distinction between the two groups.
In some way, kind of the lowering, the distinctions can remain, but the political, a sense of political hierarchy usually has to go. That way, that is the only way to have some sort of genuine acceptance of the settler when if that settler doesn't have any political privileges, right?
So in that way, I guess you could say, like, decolonization in the context of Israel-Palestine could simply mean the creation of an equal binational society or a liberal democracy.
If Israel endowed, for instance, I don't see this as a viable scenario, but if Israel, for instance, endows the Gazans and the people in the West Bank with Israeli citizenship, and it is something that those people are willing to accept, and then move towards interacting politically via citizenship, then the colonial relationship between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip will have disappeared, but the settler colonial aspect will now be consolidated.
In the sense that they would have succeeded in integrating Gaza.
Exactly. So this goes back to the very beginning. Colonialism and settler colonialism are on different ends of the spectrum, and there's available movement between the two. Now, if you decolonize the relationship with the Palestinians in the West Bank, you will be essentially re-settler colonizing the entire Zionist project and getting rid of all the colonial relationships that Israel has with the indigenous people in the alterities, the non-Jews of Israel-Palestine. Those so if de-settler colonization, not decolonization, de-settler colonization would probably require all Jews to leave, and it will also require all Americans, all white Americans to leave, and all Asian Americans to leave, and even African Americans to leave, and leaving only the Native Americans. So if that isn't something that someone demands that happen in Israel, then for consistency's sake, they should also volunteer to board a plane and move to a country of origin.
Right, and that's, so just to conclude, then there's this kind of confusion, it seems, in the public mind and in the way people talk about these terms between colonialism and settler colonialism. And many people...
It's more than the public mind. It's among the finest scholars of the conflict. I mean,
would it be not better
names? The most talented people I know fall into this word salad and basically use colonialism as interchangeable with settler colonialism, and both as Zionism is poo-poo. That's basically how.
So given this confusion, I guess was my final question, would it not be better then to just discard this, term that has generated so much, because of its amalgam of the settler and the colonialism? Would we not be better off today just trying to, not to teach our students? You're teaching, of course, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do we even need to bring this in? I mean, wouldn't it be better to avoid the kind of confusion, certainly to avoid the potential that some students might think that the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is for all Israeli Jews to leave? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't we be better off to just, consign this term to the dustbin of history?
I don't know. I know for a fact that I would have been better off had I not used this term and not entered into one of the most loaded, controversial, polarized, and an arena where people just don't listen to what other people are saying. Yeah, it would have been better for me. It's just that I find it very useful to explain certain aspects of Zionism. I would even say the more liberal aspects of Zionism, because if you just say nationalism or colonialism, then it's very easy to explain all the times that Zionists behave poorly towards Palestinians. But there is a history in which Zionists acted differently. I'm not saying in a more benevolent way, I'm not saying in an inherently good or moral way, but in a way that worked very differently and created amongst Palestinian Arabs and Zionist Jews that come from Europe, created certain ties and certain relationships that aren't imaginable in a colonial situation. And, we saw it on the right after October 7th, the general identification of the Palestinian Arab citizens. These are Palestinian people that sometimes identify as Palestinian, horrified and shocked by this attack, and really feeling kinship with the people that, and some Palestinian Arabs were hurt, were attacked and killed and kidnapped. So there's this, and then there's the American undergrad in the Ivy League who's saying from the river to the sea. And there's a disconnect between the two. And I think settler colonialism explains that disconnect the best, to me at least. And so I myself personally can't seem to find a good reason. I don't have a good reason to get rid of it, but I agree with you that as a field, we are not better off. We are not better off after this this concept has been injected to it because that it uses the term colonialism, and because I think it exacerbated a certain polarization that isn't good for research, for sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I know there was a lot to cover there, so I hope our audience is now is slightly better informed about the meaning of the term settler colonialism, how it differs from the term colonialism and its uses and abuses in the context of Israel-Palestine. It's the value added that it can add, but also some of the potential problems that can go along with that. I want to thank you, Arnon, for...
Thank you, Dov. Excellent questions. They've really teased out the important parts. I don't think I've been able to, in such a short time, I think, cover that much space. So thanks so much, Dov.
My pleasure. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This has been an episode of Israel in Depth, produced by the UCLA-Trained Center for Israel Studies. Thank you again for listening, and be on the lookout for more episodes soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. Bye-bye.